It's stuck. Take it off, please. Alien woman is begging. Somewhere deep in the Appalachian backwoods, hidden where the moss grew thick and pine shadows swallowed the sky, Darius lived like a ghost in a world of gears and rust. His cabin, more shed than home, nestled beneath towering firs that groaned in the wind like old bones. The late afternoon light filtered through dense foliage in golden slats, catching dust motes dancing in the still air. Inside, Darius wiped a greasy wrench with a rag stained the color of engine oil and regret. Shirtless, skin bronzed from years under sun and solder, he worked beside a cluttered workbench. Half a beer sweated into a ring on the scarred wood. A gutted carburetor rested like a corpse on a dissecting tray. He liked the quiet. The aloneness. The rhythm of machines that only spoke when you asked them right. Then. Knock. He stilled. No one knocked. Not out here. Second knock. Sharper. Urgent. Not a question, a plea. Darius dropped the rag. Reached beneath the counter. Glock. Chambered. Safety off. He moved slow to the door and cracked it open. What he saw made him forget how to breathe. A woman. No, something more. She stood, barely. Her legs trembled under her. Her skin a bruised shade of violet, not from injury but nature. Alien. Etched with faint bioluminescence. Her body was cased in a black, burnished armor that shimmered as if thinking. I need help, she whispered. Her voice low, clipped. Fighting to stay composed. Darius opened the door wider. Wordless. Motioned her inside. She stepped forward, then collapsed into the wooden chair near the stove. The room was dim, warm from a dying fire, light flickering across her body like living oil. What the hell is that thing? He asked, kneeling beside her. The armor shifted with a ripple, like it heard him. It pulsed tighter around her ribs. Adaptive biosuit, she rasped. Experimental. Failing. Post-impact malfunction. Impact. Crash. Sabotage, she said through clenched teeth. Ejected seconds before it ruptured. Her breaths came short. The suit hissed with each exhale, fighting her lungs. You need a hospital. No. Her head snapped up. Her eyes burned like twin embers. A blade. A steady hand. Not tech. Not scans. You. Darius exhaled. He pulled on gloves. Grabbed the flashlight from the bench. The beam cut down her torso, pausing at the junction where armor met flesh. It had fused, not welded, grown in. Name. Sena. He nodded once. All right, Sena. Let's get this thing off before it crushes you. She looked at him, really looked. Her gaze flicked from his calloused hands to the sweat gleaming on his collarbone. Thank you, Darius. He blinked. Didn't tell you my name. It's etched into your wrench. You're not exactly covert. You're bossy for someone about to code out. A strained smile. You're shirtless for someone holding pliers. He huffed. Pulled up a second chair. Saturday. The heat between them made the cabin feel smaller. He stared at the armor across her abdomen, where seams pulsed like heartbeats. Let's see what's stuck. This wasn't armor. It was living tech, a second skin coated to nerves and instinct. The seam at her left hip quivered under the light. You sure about this? No, she said. Her voice trembled now. But you're all I've got. He pressed the blade gently into the seam. The suit hummed. Reacted. Coiled like a snake. A jolt. Her body spasmed. Breathe. She nodded, but her jaw clenched. Sweat beaded at her temple, slid down her neck. Her skin glistened, a surreal, violet sheen. Her breaths came ragged. It tightens when I panic, she hissed. Reads my cortisol levels. Then don't panic. Don't give me a reason to. He smiled grimly. Traced a groove thinner than a nerve. A panel clicked. Warm air burst out. She gasped. Her hips jerked instinctively. Her hand gripped the edge of the chair so hard her knuckles paled. Stage 1, she muttered. Good. You're doing good. Thanks for the performance review. He kept going. Every plate he pried loose revealed more violet skin beneath the suit. Every inch was a confession, strength shaped by survival. Flesh wrapped in defiance. Her thigh quivered. She sucked air through her teeth. I can't hold still. He slid his hand under her knee. Grounded her. Fingers firm. Let me do the holding. You focus on breathing. She shuddered under his touch. Why are you doing this? She whispered. He didn't look up. Just said, quietly, because I've been left behind. I don't leave others. Another panel. Click. This one at her chest. Heat rolled out. Her breath hitched again. That one was over your heart. Didn't want to make you nervous. He glanced up. Met her eyes. Too late. You're a menace. I'm not dead yet. He reached the final clasp. It sat just beneath her sternum. He hesitated only for breath, then pressed in. Click. Everything shifted. The cabin went quiet. Just the sound of their breathing. Her body sagged forward, caught herself with trembling arms. Sweat dripped from her chin. Her undersuit clung to her like melted obsidian. Darius stood. His shirt clung to him like a second skin. He wiped his brow. You all right? She didn't answer right away. Then, voice rough, no. The worst part's coming. His brow furrowed. Define worst. She leaned back. Let the last pieces of armor fall away from her frame. What remained was sleek, heat-shimmering cloth molded to her every line. Alive. She looked at him. Not with fear. Not with desperation. With trust, the kind you bleed for. Now, she said, breath catching. You have to help me get the rest off. And she didn't flinch. The cabin was stifling. Not from the fire, it had died down hours ago, but from the heat curling off her skin, radiating in invisible waves. Sena's body shimmered under the dim light, the obsidian suit clinging to her like a second breath. It pulsed faintly, as if reluctant to let go, as if aware it was losing its host. Darius didn't speak. He didn't need to. The moment she said it, you have to help me get the rest off, he felt the shift in the air. Not tension. Not lust. Something deeper. Like standing too close to an open flame and knowing it'll scar you, but stepping forward anyway. He knelt in front of her. The hardwood creaked. Outside, the forest exhaled in a gust of wind that pressed against the cabin walls like a warning. Inside, time slowed. Where's the worst of it? He asked, voice steady. Her fingers trembled as she touched the small of her back. Spine. Core. Upper thighs. It's spreading fast. He didn't hesitate. Calloused hands moved to the edges of the remaining armor. Not the hard plating, just the suit underneath. The material was warm, too warm, soft like liquid metal, reactive. As his fingers made contact, she gasped. Her hips jerked, involuntary. Sorry, he muttered. Don't be. It's not pain. It's sensitivity. She met his gaze, eyes darker now, pupils dilated. Like nerve endings were sharpened. He worked slowly. The suit responded to every breath, every flinch, its nanostructure trying to adapt to her emotional surges. Sweat beaded along her collarbones, slipped down between her breasts, caught at the rim of the suit's seam. Darius traced the spine seam with 2 fingers, pressing at a release point just above her hips. The suit shuddered. "That's it," she whispered. "It's disconnecting." Another breath. Another click. Darius moved to her thighs. The suit resisted. Tension rolled through her body. "You okay?" "No," she said, voice raw. "But keep going." He peeled the suit back, inch by inch. Beneath it, her violet skin flushed a deeper shade, too much heat, too fast. Her hands clenched the sides of the chair. Her head dropped back, breath ragged. "Darius. I've got you." She tilted forward suddenly, arms wrapping around his neck. She was burning. "It wasn't just pressure regulation," she said near his ear. "The armor, it controlled hormone output. Core temperature. Without it, I destabilize. Then we stabilize you. I need proximity. Not machines. Not cold. You." Darius didn't answer. He shifted her carefully, guiding her onto the cot nearby. Her body curled toward him, instinctive. He lay beside her, fully clothed except for the sweat slicking his skin. She pressed against him, legs tangled, face buried in his chest. "Darius. If I lose control again." "You won't. You don't know that. Then I'll burn with you." Her fingers dug into his back. Every touch was charged. Not lust, need. Primal. Chemical. 2 biologies trying to sync in a storm. Minutes passed. Her breathing slowed. The shimmer in her skin dimmed. Her body, once coiled like wire, softened. She spoke again, barely audible. "This isn't intimacy." "No. But it feels like it. I know. If I say something that sounds like more, ignore it." He smirked. "If I say something that sounds like more, I won't." She laughed, small, breathy. A release of pressure. He stroked her spine gently. "Your body thinks it's safe now." She nodded against his chest. "Because of you." Darius didn't speak. Just held her. Outside, the forest whispered. Inside, something sacred passed between them, silent, raw, undeniable. The night pressed in around the cabin like velvet soaked in shadow. Outside, the wind stirred the treetops, whispering secrets to the stars. Inside, the heat clung to everything, blankets, breath, skin. But it wasn't just the temperature that lingered in the air. It was Sena. Her presence. Her pulse. She lay curled against Darius, her breath a slow metronome against his chest. The sheen of sweat on her back had begun to cool, but her body trembled in small aftershocks, like distant thunder rolling through her muscles. "Still with me?" Darius whispered into her hair. She didn't answer immediately. Then, with effort, barely. "But I'm here." He slid his hand up the ridge of her spine. Her skin was hot to the touch, still regulating, still fluctuating like a system learning its new baseline. "What's it feel like now?" She exhaled, slow. "Like standing at the edge of a cliff. Only gravity's inside you. Pulling." Darius didn't move. He let her settle, her leg draped over his thigh, her arm looped beneath his ribs like she was anchoring herself. "I don't understand how this works," he admitted quietly. "It's biology and legacy. My kind evolved under extremes. The suit, it wasn't just armor. It suppressed our urges to connect. To bond. Survival protocol. And without it, everything we bury rises. Darius turned slightly, just enough to see her face. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Not just from physiology. From something stirring beneath. What's rising in you now? Her throat worked around the truth. Need. Attachment. Want. It's not voluntary. It's genetic. Hormonal bonding under extreme stress. So this is chemistry. It started as chemistry. She touched his face, fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. But it's becoming choice. And that terrifies me more than anything. Darius's hand found her hip, held her steady. Then let's be scared together. She leaned into him. Her lips brushed his throat, slow, reverent. Not asking. Not demanding. Just present. Their bodies synced, breaths aligning, pulses merging like frequencies tuning to one another. The tension shifted again. No longer survival. Something softer. She whispered, if I say I want to stay like this, I won't stop you. If I say I don't want it to end, I'll believe you. She kissed him then. Not fire, but embers. Smoldering. Unrushed. Her body molded to his with the confidence of instinct. Not seduction. Surrender. Darius didn't push, didn't guide. He simply met her there, at the edge of something vast, and frightening, and real. They lay like that until the heat ebbed. Until the air cooled. Until the bond between them stopped being chemical and became something else. Sena's voice was soft against his chest. This is the first time I've ever felt. He waited. She closed her eyes. Free. He kissed the crown of her head. Then let's never give it back. Outside, dawn touched the edges of the world with gold. Inside, they held on to the warmth neither of them had known they needed. The morning was too still. Sunlight filtered through the canopy like molten gold, but no birds called. No squirrels rustled the branches. The forest, alive just hours ago, held its breath. Darius noticed it first, lying awake beside Sena, her head still resting against his chest. His instincts, honed by years in black ops, screamed watched. She stirred, immediately alert. Her hand moved toward the wristband embedded in her forearm, a remnant of her now shed armor. A faint blue light pulsed. They're close, she said, voice tight. Darius swung his legs off the cot, pulling on his shirt, sidearm already in hand. He crossed the room in 3 strides, opened the false panel in the floor. Tactical gear, loaded magazines, military-grade armor. Not bad for a mechanic, Sena muttered as she stepped into a lightweight combat shell he tossed her way. Didn't always fix engines, Darius replied. Used to break people. Government changed. I didn't. She strapped on the chest plate, her violet skin disappearing beneath matte black. Her expression changed too, softer edges sharpening. The warrior returned. They'll want me alive, she said. But not whole. Darius paused mid-load. You're not just a soldier. No, she said. I was bred into a political alliance. Royal blood. Promised to a house that wanted my genetics, not my consent. You ran. Not just ran. Her gaze darkened. I stole the prototype. The armor. Meant for my betrothed. Their future enforcer. I made it mine. He nodded slowly. That made you a threat. Worse. It made me free. A sound outside, branches snapping. Sena turned to him, urgency cutting through her voice. We have 10 minutes. Maybe less. Darius grabbed a compact rifle. Checked the charge. Slid a blade into his boot. There's a ravine east of here. My backup cache is in a collapsed mining tunnel. We fall back, then plan. Agreed. She moved to the door, then paused. Darius, you didn't ask what they'd do if they catch me. He didn't look at her. Just tightened the strap on his gear. Because they won't. They left without looking back. The woods swallowed them quickly, but the silence followed. Sena moved like she belonged to the terrain, low, fast, aware of every sound. Darius trailed a half-step behind, his mind cataloging exit routes and elevation changes. They'll scan for biosignatures, she said as they reached the outer tree line. But they won't expect ground-level trackers. Darius crouched near a fallen log, his fingers brushing the soil. Fresh. 3 pairs. Human gait. Heavy armor. Sweepers, she muttered. Vanguard. Soft probe. The elite follow. How long do we have? She glanced to the sky, then back at the dirt. Not long enough. A faint vibration trembled through the ground. Darius stood. We dig in. Hold the ridge. Make it a kill box. Sena didn't hesitate. Then we end this. Together. The ridge loomed ahead, a skeletal spine of earth and stone overgrown with frost-hardened moss and knotted roots. Sena crouched low behind a fallen tree, her breath fogging the chilled morning air. Darius lay beside her, adjusting the optics on his rifle. The silence around them was surgical, precise, heavy. The forest held its breath. Movement, Darius muttered. North Ridge. 3 targets. Standard recon spacing. Sena nodded. That's not the kill squad. They're just sweeping. Then we let them pass. Take the command unit. She glanced at him, a flicker of challenge in her eyes. You calling shots now? I thought we were taking turns. She smirked, then vanished into the undergrowth. Darius held position. Watched. Waited. The first mercenary crested the ridge, clad in lightweight tactical armor laced with blue-glow telemetry strips. Darius barely moved, just a shift of the finger. Click. The suppressed shot caught the man clean behind the ear. He dropped like a puppet cut from string. A second figure spun to react, too slow. Sena hit from the left like a thunderclap, her pulse blade buried deep into the soldier's side. The third merc turned, got half a shot off before Darius dropped to mid-step. The silence returned. Brief. Then the ground began to tremble. Sena looked toward the trees. They're sending the heavy. Darius braced. You ready? She wiped the blood off her blade against the grass. Born ready. A deep hum filled the air, mechanical, violent. The foliage parted to reveal a towering figure encased in exoskeletal armor, twin plasma cannons mounted over its shoulders. Red targeting lenses scanned the tree line. Sena's voice was ice. He's command. Good, Darius muttered. Let's break the head off the snake. The mech opened fire. Blue plasma tore through the trees like divine wrath. Darius and Sena scattered, opposite sides, flank and crush. Darius rolled behind a boulder, heart slamming. He caught the rhythm of the cannon, timed the brakes in fire. Sena moved like wind, graceful, exact. She darted from tree to rock, closing the gap. A flash of her blade caught the mech's attention. Darius took the shot. First round, shoulder servo. Sparks. Second round, hip joint. Metal screamed. The exo-unit staggered. Sena leapt, slammed a plasma detonator against its spine. She dove as it exploded, deafening, searing. The mech collapsed in a smoldering heap. Darius emerged from cover, coughing through the smoke. He found her kneeling over the wreckage. You good? She looked up, blood streaking her cheek. Eyes blazing. Better than good, she said. But her voice broke as a shimmer appeared in the smoke. Another figure. No armor. Just a dark officer's coat, and a face twisted with familiarity. Darius raised his weapon. Sena froze. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That's my cousin. Smoke clung to the treetops like ghosts reluctant to leave. Sena stood paralyzed, staring through the haze at the man who emerged from it. Hello, cousin, the figure said, voice calm, eyes cold. You've made quite the mess. Darius moved to stand beside her, weapon still raised, but she didn't move. Her jaw tightened. Why are you here, Rel? He smiled. The kind of smile that came before something broke. To bring you home. One way or another. You won't. I already have. Before Darius could blink, Rel tapped something on the gauntlet at his wrist. Sena cried out. Her body buckled, knees hitting the dirt hard. She gasped, eyes wide, hands clawing at her own skin. A soft whine hummed from somewhere inside her. Darius dove to her side. What the hell? Neural override, Rel said casually. Failsafe embedded in the residuals of the armor. You should have known we'd planned for betrayal. Darius didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sena's shoulders, held her as her spine arched unnaturally. Her body convulsed like a live wire. Breathe, Pina. Stay with me. Look at me. Her eyes met his for a flicker of a second, pure agony. Darius's voice dropped to a snarl. You son of a... But Rel vanished in a blink of light, teleport tech, high tier. Sena collapsed. Darius caught her before she hit the ground. Her skin was ice now. Sweat poured from her brow. Her lips were pale, trembling. I'll kill him, she whispered. Her voice cracked. I swear to the stars, I'll. Not without me, you won't. He scooped her into his arms and ran. No time for sentiment. No room for fury. Just survival. They reached the abandoned civilian safe house just as dawn broke. The valley below was gray-blue, painted in ash and mist. Darius kicked the door open, carried her to the single sagging bed, and laid her down. She shivered violently. You're burning up again, he muttered, pressing his palm to her forehead. Overload. Hormonal. Neural. He grabbed the med injector from his side pack. Jammed it into her shoulder. The hiss of serum filled the silence. She arched, then collapsed back, groaning. Still feel like fire? She blinked up at him. It's worse than before. He used the override to spike my core. Everything's out of sync. If it builds again, then we release it. Same way as before. Her fingers curled into his shirt, desperate. Darius, if this keeps happening, if I keep needing you to stabilize me, then I'll be there every time. She looked at him like she wanted to believe. Like she didn't know how. You don't understand, she whispered. This isn't just chemistry anymore. It's fusion. Bonding. If I keep drawing from you, we become linked. Permanently. Darius didn't flinch. Then we burn together. She shuddered. Pulled him down into the bed beside her. The moment their skin touched, the trembling slowed. Her pulse found rhythm. Her breath deepened. The danger wasn't over. But she was alive. And so was he. The sun had barely begun to rise. Pale silver light crept through the warped slats of the safe house walls, casting faint bars across the worn floorboards. The silence in the room was thick with held breath, suspended between survival and something that felt dangerously close to surrender. Sena lay on her side, facing away from Darius, her body barely covered by a thermal blanket. The air had cooled, but the heat pulsing from her was unmistakable. It wasn't fever, it was something deeper. Something primal. Darius sat on the edge of the bed, hunched forward, elbows on his knees. Shirtless, arms streaked with sweat and soot, he watched her back rise and fall in uneven rhythm. "You're not stabilizing," he said finally. She didn't answer. "Your skin's too hot. You're still burning." "I know," she whispered. He turned. She was looking at him now, eyes darker than night, pupils wide, pupils wild. "It's not just residual trauma anymore," she said. The override triggered a reproductive reflex. An evolutionary override. Darius blinked. "Explain." "My species. When survival becomes that personal, that intimate, our biology interprets it as selection. Our systems start to pair bond. Chemically. Biologically. Irrevocably." She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulder. Her skin glistened in the low light, every muscle drawn tight like a bowstring. "I'm not just overheating, Darius. I'm transitioning." "Into what?" "Into someone who needs you. Like an anchor. Like a match." He stood. Crossed the room. Knelt in front of her. "You say that like it's a bad thing." "Because it could be," she said. "Because I don't want to want. I want to choose. But right now, my body is making the choice for me." Darius reached out. Touched her arm. Her skin was lava hot. "Then let me help you slow it down. Let's get control back." She searched his face, fingers curling at her side. Then she nodded. "Just once." He climbed onto the bed behind her, wrapped himself around her from behind. His chest against her back. Arm draped across her waist. No rush. Just presence. Minutes passed. Her body shivered against his, like storm winds trapped in flesh. But she didn't pull away. "This isn't weakness," he whispered against her neck. "No," she said, voice ragged. "This is terrifying. Because I feel safe." Then we make a choice. Not chemistry. Not protocol. Just, us. She exhaled. Her breath trembled. But it was a release. Darius held her until her breathing evened out. Until her core temperature eased. Until the fire became a glow. When he finally felt her relax, he whispered, "Still burning?" She turned slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. "Yes. But now it's a different kind of heat." Dawn climbed higher, streaking pale gold across the valley. In the distance, the horizon smoldered with the memory of plasma fire, but inside the safe house, the world had gone quiet. The scent of charred metal clung to Darius's skin. Sena sat on the edge of the bed now, hair damp, pulled back with a wire strap. Her posture was different, no longer bracing. She was upright. Centered. Darius watched her in silence, leaning against the wall with a mug of bitter coffee cooling in his hand. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, not turning to face him. "Sometimes," he said. "Usually when I'm too tired to stop it." She looked over her shoulder, and something in her eyes had shifted. Not the heat. Not the fire. Clarity. "I don't want to keep running." Darius set the mug down. Crossed the room. "Then don't." She stood. Stepped toward him. The air between them buzzed, residual charge from everything they'd survived. "It's not that easy," she said. "You don't know my world. What they'll do. Then show me. Take me with you. You'd go." He didn't blink. "I'm already in it. I chose this the second I opened that door." She inhaled, shaky. Her hands curled into fists. "I don't want to lose who I am just to survive." Darius reached for her hand. Wrapped his fingers around hers. "Then let's build something that lets you be more." She studied him. Deep, steady. Like she was trying to map every fracture in his soul, and deciding she liked what she saw. "You know they won't stop." Good. We'll give them something they can't understand. What's that? Two people choosing each other. When everything else said run. A long silence passed between them, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like breath held before a leap. Then we make our stand, she said. He smiled. Together. Sena stepped in close, her forehead resting against his. Their connection now wasn't about fire or need, it was about defiance. About choosing to be more than weapons, more than fugitives. Home isn't where you're from, she whispered. It's who stands beside you when the fire comes. Then I'm already there, he said. Outside, the wind shifted. They packed in silence. Side by side. No longer hiding. No longer alone. They left the safe house before the wind changed direction. Darius moved with calm precision, eyes always scanning the tree line. Sena walked beside him, no longer wavering, no longer hiding. They didn't speak much. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said with breath, blood, and burned-out circuitry. The woods were scarred. Craters from plasma strikes pocked the hillsides. Trees leaned like wounded soldiers. Smoke still curled from fallen branches, mixing with the crisp scent of pine and wet earth. Sena paused at the ridge. Below them, a plume of gray smoke twisted lazily into the sky. That's where he set the relay, she said. The signal rail used to lock me down. The fallback tower. Darius adjusted his grip on the rifle. Still active. She tapped her wrist interface. It blinked. A faint ping echoed. Not for long. They descended into the valley, weaving through ash and silence. It wasn't until they reached the base of the ridge that they saw it, half collapsed, wires sparking, a low hum rising from the exposed generator. The relay tower. Sena didn't hesitate. She pulled a pulse grenade from her side, armed it with a single thumb flick. You sure? Darius asked. She looked at him, eyes hard. I'm done being traced. Done being tagged like inventory. He stepped back. She hurled the grenade. The explosion wasn't loud. It was final. A crack of energy that dropped the structure in on itself. Metal groaned, cables burst into sparks, and then, quiet. Not just silence. Relief. Darius watched her exhale. She turned to him, eyes no longer glowing with pressure, but with something steadier. I was born into a cage, Darius. Even before the armor. Even before the war. I didn't know what freedom looked like until you looked at me like I had a choice. He stepped closer. Touched her cheek. You always had one. You just needed space to believe it. She leaned into his palm. Let her eyes close. Behind them, the last embers of the signal tower burned down into dust. And ahead, the path wasn't clear. But it was theirs. The sky had turned to iron. Heavy clouds loomed above the treetops as Darius and Sena moved through the ravine, boots crunching over loose shale. The path twisted sharply ahead, narrowing between jagged stone and blackened bark. A storm was building, not in the atmosphere, but in the network. Sena's wrist interface buzzed, low and steady. They're pulling back their search pattern, she said, eyes narrowing. Which means they know where we're going. Let them come, Darius replied. They'll regret it. Sena paused at a cliff's edge overlooking the hydroplant ruins. The facility looked dead, collapsed towers, moss-choked generators, and the distant flicker of shielded drones weaving between rusted pipelines. But the faint signal spike on her scanner told another story. Rel's not dead, she said. Then let's make sure he doesn't get a second chance. They moved down the slope in silence, passing through a tangle of broken machinery and steel skeletons. At the plant's entrance, Darius dropped to one knee and cracked open a security panel. The override he used wasn't elegant, just effective. The door groaned open with a hydraulic wheeze. After you, he said. This time, we go in together. Inside, the plant was colder than expected. Echoes followed their steps, bouncing off cracked concrete and corroded bulkheads. The central control room flickered to life as Sena's presence activated the relay. I'm not hiding anymore, she said to the empty air. No more running. No more restraints. A voice crackled through the console. Then die standing, cousin. Rel's signal surged from above. The catwalk exploded in sparks as he stepped into view, scarred, limping, one cybernetic eye glowing bright. You broke the link. You think that changes anything? It changes everything, Sena replied. Darius raised his rifle, but Rel had already drawn. Plasma rounds tore through the air. They scattered. Sena darted left, flanking. Darius dove behind a column, firing off cover shots. Sena moved like lightning. Vaulted the scaffolding. Landed behind Rel. This ends now. You won't shoot me, Rel said. She hesitated. Just long enough. He fired. Darius tackled her sideways. The beam scorched past, grazing her shoulder. Don't give him time, Darius growled. Sena stood. Bleeding. Angry. You want my legacy? She shouted. Here's your inheritance. She hurled the override core she'd ripped from his last device, wired to a plasma charge. It struck his chest. Beeped. Glowed. Wait. She fired. A single pulse. The explosion lit the room like a collapsing star. Debris rained. Silence followed. Then, breathing. Darius stood. Found her in the smoke. Pulled her into him. It's over. No, she whispered. Now it begins. Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain washed the blood from her skin. From his hands. From the steel floor where a tyrant once stood. They walked out shoulder to shoulder. No more fugitives. Only fire-forged survivors. Only freedom.